Hey everybody, and welcome to Oslo. This is a brand new and slightly unusual series for me, partly because I've never done a recreation series before, but more so because these videos aren't actually the main focus of this project, at least for me. They're more or less a byproduct, because I've been asked to recreate Oslo, and I figured I might as well record the process and turn it into a video series, but it's not actually the main focus to do so. And why that is, and what exactly I'm doing, I'll try my best to explain in the rest of this video, since it's just going to be more or less standard fare for me, with time-lapses with some commentary over it, explaining the whole project, and also talking a bit about Oslo, since, as I've come to learn, it's actually a pretty interesting city. So there will be plenty of time to explain everything. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. So in this first episode, I'll mostly be working on the map creation itself. There's some bits that I left out of this, and it's mostly the creation of the overlay and the height map, which is something kind of tedious that I had to do outside of the game. By the way, I have to give a huge thanks to the creators of terrain.party and the creators of the overlay mod, since these were absolutely necessary elements to recreate the map of Oslo. But in the rest of this episode, I'm really just trying to refine the map that came out of that whole process, and making sure that all of these weird square bits and very rough, unsmooth parts of the map are kind of smoothed out. It won't be perfect, and I can definitely get into the details later, but I just want to make sure that at this point, the map is going to be ready to put the roads in place and get to the city itself. So all in all, this is going to be a little bit of a boring process, which is perfect for me, since this episode I really want to focus on explaining what this whole project is. And I know I've been really vague in the intro, but to be very honest, there's not much more that I can say, especially without going into territory where I might say stuff that's not entirely right, since everything is still a little bit vague, for me especially still, since the whole project is still in a planning phase, but I'll try my best to still explain this as clearly as I can. So a couple of weeks ago, when I was still in Japan, I got this email from a digital agency called Hyper, and they had this project for me. Honestly, they're not really the focus of this. The real focus of this is the NMBU, which is the real star of the show here, and the reason that this is all happening. It's a university in Norway, which is not too far from Oslo, and I think the English name would be the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, which might not sound too related, but among other things, they educate city planners and architects and urban designers, that sort of corner. So you might already see where the connection is here. And their project, which Hyper tried to link me to, is basically that they want to have a recreation of Oslo in Cities Skylines to use as a way to raise awareness and interest in urban development. And I already thought this was a really cool thing once I read that first email, even if everything was still really much in a planning phase and still very ambiguous, since it's honestly always been something which I thought Cities Skylines has a lot of potential when it comes to, because even though I don't really agree with some of the earlier sentiments which came out, especially in the TED Talk a while ago, that Cities Skylines has the potential to be used by city developers or city planners, I think it has a lot of potential to raise awareness and create an interest in city planning, which is especially relevant given that so many people live in cities and so many more people are going to live in cities, and yet most people don't really understand how they work. And I can definitely see that Cities Skylines has raised a general public interest in urban development. So that's really cool, and that's why this really resonated with me. And what the university really wanted to do, and so the project of the NMBU was to pair up a streaming personality with master students and have them look at Oslo in Cities Skylines to try and kind of tackle, but mostly try and explore ideas of urban development and issues that Oslo is facing in real life in game. And so it doesn't really have to be an exact connection. Like, there doesn't have to be an exact one-to-one recreation of the real-life issues, since that's honestly something that Cities Skylines still very much suffers from, is that it doesn't have perfect traffic simulation. The people don't act the same way that they do in real life, and these kinds of things are just really practical things that you can't have in a game like this, that you really have to think about in real life, let alone things like property borders or politics, which are huge issues in things like urban development, but not really a part of Cities Skylines. And they're things that you nonetheless can discuss in the game and use the game as a platform to bounce these kind of dialogues from. And so that's really the idea of the project, to use these streams to get this promotion for the whole idea of urban development and looking at the issues that Oslo is facing. Which I think is a really interesting way to use the game. I think we saw some earlier similar things, I remember, in some other Nordic countries. I believe a while ago there was, for instance, a project in Stockholm where a new developed part of the city was being opened in Cities Skylines for citizens to try and give their own input into how they think it should be developed. And I think a very similar project was made in another Finnish city as well. So I think this is kind of similar to how Cities Skylines has been used so far, if it's been used in a public sphere or a commercial project or any of that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's something that the game actually does work for quite well. I don't quite think that the game is a perfect tool to recreate issues of urban development, but I think it's an amazing way to create some civic engagement in the field of urban development, and that is something which I think any city can really benefit from. And so what the university was looking for was, as for the way that I've been put so far, something that is a believable copy of Oslo, since obviously there are a lot of problems if you're trying to recreate a city exactly in the game. And so the focus will really just be on making sure that it's a believable copy, that all of the roads are in the same places, that all of the terrain and nature is more or less the same. But since there are really no assets whatsoever from Oslo on the workshop, which is kind of sad. I think a lot of the other Scandinavian cities do have some assets. It'll just be really difficult to recreate Oslo exactly. So on a functional level, it should be recreated as close as possible with the same road system, the same infrastructure, getting the garbage to and from the same places, getting the water supply to and from the same places, etc. And making sure that when you look at it from above, you've got the same layouts and everything looks the same. But on a street level, it's going to be very difficult to recreate it, and honestly I'm not entirely sure yet at this point how well it's going to be done, because at the moment that I'm speaking I'm still doing all of the road systems, so we'll see how that is going to go. But in the end we should end up with a believable copy of Oslo, which can be used to bring up some conversations about the issues that Oslo is facing as a city at the moment. And yeah, that is basically going to be the goal of this project. Why I was going to be the chosen person to do this, I'm still not entirely sure, but we'll get there at some point, and I think it should be fine in the end. Just as a small update from my side, by the way, if you're watching this and you're into my Cities Skylines content and you're wondering why I haven't done anything with this game in half a year, at least on YouTube, I have been playing this game and I have been keeping up with the workshop, but I couldn't make any videos of Amar City because Amar City was on my computer back home, and for some reason I hadn't synchronized my Steam Cloud before I went to Japan, so when I was in Japan I literally didn't have access to Amar City. So I know I've been out of this game a lot on YouTube, but I've still been playing and I'm still in this thing, and I'm low-key thinking about another recreation which I don't want to say much more about. But as a general life update, yeah, there's still some more stuff for me to happen in Cities Skylines, but for now this is just going to be a side project for me and something which I'm honestly crunching on, and which you'll see a lot more videos of in a very short time frame. since the deadline for this project is actually coming up in about a week from now, at least from my side. So between now and the next 2 weeks should be when most of my content is coming out on this thing. So it's all on quite a small time frame and really a bit of a marathon, considering that I'm usually sort of spreading my videos out a little bit more. But yeah, that should be fine in the end. I think it's about time that I also talk about Oslo a little bit for the uninitiated, I suppose, but also because it is kind of relevant to talk about certain parts of Oslo that are more important than others. So as a very, very general introduction for those who might not be too familiar, Oslo is the capital of Norway, and it's quite northern. It's really it is the most northern country in Western Europe. And even though Oslo is somewhere in the south of Norway, it is still quite northern on the continent, and it sits right in the middle of a fjord. It's got lots of mountains around it and lots of water as well, so it's a very difficult terrain to work with, and I think that's also definitely something that you can tell in the way that Oslo has been made. There are so many highway tunnels and roads that go over and underneath each other, even in the center of the city. It's really built on a lot of different levels, and that makes the city very compact, but also very difficult to build infrastructure for. So it's really a little bit of a mess, not in a negative way, but in that everything is really one big spaghetti of roads and infrastructure in the city. So that's one thing that's quite typical about the city. It's also a city which has been growing very much only in recent years, and because of that, it's never really traditionally been a really huge city like other European cities might have been. So the city itself architecturally is also a bit of a mixture of a lot of old buildings, a lot of new buildings, but an overall very European style with very high density and some of those real high density blocks in the city center, which is nonetheless, I still think, a very typical European thing. And obviously it also doesn't have that gridded layout that you'll see with American cities, but a very messy layout with roads kind of going everywhere and no particular order or scheme to the road layout, as it's just an organic one that's just kind of grown over the years in a way that I suppose works best for the city, and especially in that very crammed environment that it's in. So it's also presents some really big challenges when it comes to recreating this city in the game. But that's also quite interesting, I think. And there were some really other interesting things about the city. It's the only place where you can take public transport to ski resorts, or at least like city public transport. Obviously there are lots of buses and ski or like trains going to ski resorts all over the world. But you can take a metro with cross-country skis and start skiing, apparently, in Oslo. So that's pretty cool. That's something which is pretty unique. As a Dutch person, that's something that I cannot relate to at all, but it's really cool to see that sort of thing. And it's also a city that is like completely devoid of tall buildings. It's only got 2 buildings, which I would maybe call skyscrapers, but even so, they're more or less just high-rises, just kind of drifting around 100 meters tall. And that aside, there are pretty much no tall buildings in the entire city, even though there are some modern flat buildings which are really high-rise-ish. One of the most famous districts of the city, and the one that you might have seen before on pictures if you don't know that much about Oslo but have seen it a few times, is an area called Barcode, which has been built very recently. It's also really controversial among the people of Oslo, I've seen, but I think it's quite neat. But it's basically a modern development alongside the Bay Area, the way that you see it at the moment in many cities around the world. And it's called Barcode because it looks like a barcode. It's kind of cheesy, but I guess it's an interesting name to name it. But that's really one of the most well-known sites of Oslo, and something that'll also be a little bit of a hard thing to actually tackle in this recreation, since there aren't any exact assets for Barcode. But that goes for a lot of the city center. Same goes for the central station area, which is quite a sort of signature part of the city, which none of the exact buildings are in the workshop for either. And for instance, the City Hall, which is a very recognizable building, there's not much for that either. And there is the... oh god, I'm gonna have to pronounce some Norwegian words and names from this point onward, so I'm sorry if this is gonna be very awkward. But there's also the Akerbrygge area, which is another sort of modern development alongside the water, which is also one of the main viewpoints that you get a lot of pictures of when you look up Oslo. I've actually asked some people who might know more about this how to pronounce certain Norwegian words, but no matter how I try, I just can't replicate the sounds with my mouth, I think. But in any case, that's just something I guess you'll have to deal with. I'm sorry about that. But my Scandinavian languages pronunciation in any Scandinavian language is really horrible. Another thing that's quite interesting about Oslo is that it's a really sustainable city. It is one of the, if not the most sustainable city in Europe. And I think it's also going to be the green capital of Europe in 2019. And it's just overall a city which is very clean in terms of energy use, very lots of water, lots of open spaces, lots of green spaces. And overall, it's also very much focused on densifying instead of sprawling. Apparently they have closed down the areas around Oslo from being constructed on, and so it's kind of similar to cities like Hong Kong maybe, in the sense that the nature around it, all of those forest hills are protected, so that the city has to look inside the city for its expansion rather than outside the city borders. So instead of the endless urban sprawl of suburban areas just going on forever, Oslo is kind of limited by those hills around it, which is a challenge, definitely, and one of the reasons why this project is happening in the first place, because making sure to densify and expand a city like that instead of just expanding a city outward, it's just a challenge. But at the same time, it's something which is quite good, because it just makes a city more livable, more sustainable. And it's really just going to be something to see how they can take these older districts, or the less dense districts of the city, and redevelop them. And that will also be one of the main focuses of the streams, which this map is going to be used for in the end. A particular area which is going to be important is, and oh god, I hope I don't butcher this name too much, but it's going to be the area of Økern, which is written with the O with a weird diagonal stripe through it, which is a Dutchman I really can't understand. But in any case, that's going to be an area which is going to be of specific focus, since they're going to redevelop it into an area called Hovenbyen, which is something like Hoven City or so. And at the moment, it's basically an area which is very sprawled out. It has lots of parking lots, lots of roundabouts, roads going everywhere, intersections, industry, and car retailers. And the idea is to redevelop it into a real city district and add offices and residential spaces into the area, and obviously turning such a space into a completely different kind of space is a huge challenge, and that's one of the ideas which is going to be tackled in this map, and which Oslo as a city in real life is going to have to tackle in the near future as well. So that's an area which I'm also going to have to take into consideration when I'm remaking Oslo, since it's one of the areas which I'm just going to have to put more detail in than some others. Speaking of which, by the way, this is definitely not going to be a detailing project. Obviously, it doesn't really have the skill to do that kind of thing. Even if Oslo doesn't seem like a huge city with 600,000 something population proper, it's still quite large when you consider the map of Cities Skylines, since this thing almost exactly fills the map of Cities Skylines. If the map in this game were even slightly smaller, the area that we wanted to feature in the map wouldn't have been large enough. So just very barely cutting it, and I'm gonna have to come very close to the edges of the map to finish this as well. So overall, it's just on way too large of a scale for me to practically add a lot of detail into this build, but also for the computer which this is going to run on to practically add a lot of detail, because there's no way that any computer would be glad with a map of such size being completely detailed. So I'm obviously going to have to kind of be much more conservative about the amount of props that I'm adding in here, but there are some parts where I want to add slightly more detail than others. So for instance, the city center is just gonna try to be as on point as possible, but some suburbs might just have less detail and just be a general road layout, and then just low density houses being thrown throughout it just by zoning, and not really spending much more time on that. And the same goes for some sites which are going to be really important, like the barcode area. I'm going to try to make them as realistic looking as possible, and the same goes for the Ökern area, to try and make that a good place to focus on in the streams. But at the same time, other parts won't quite be as detailed or get as much attention. Besides, there's also the thing that I'm trying to do this in not that much time. From the beginning until the end of creating this is going to be about 2 weeks of time, and that is starting from completely nothing. So there's also not that much time to make this the best recreation ever. Focus is really on making this a believable recreation of Oslo. And as for me personally, and maybe this is an interesting thing to talk about while this is going on in the background, and I haven't even mentioned it so far, this means that I'm taking the overlay of Oslo, and in this episode I am just trying to copy over the main roads. Which means that in one window I've got Cities Skylines with the overlay in the game map laid over the height map, so they are aligning. And in another window on the internet I've got Google Maps open to kind of read what kind of roads I'm placing where, since obviously all that the overlay shows is where the roads are, and I'm just comparing it to Google Maps to see what kind of roads they are. So as much as I can, I'm trying to put 2-lane roads in places where there are 2-lane roads in real life, and 4-lane roads in places where there are 4-lane roads in real life, etc. I tried to go to the level of getting the same streetlights. Unfortunately, I haven't really found any streetlights that are matching up exactly with what I was looking for, only in a few parts of the city. So it won't be quite that much into detail. But I think overall, if you're recreating a city in Cities Skylines and you're looking to do something similar, creating a height map and then making sure you've got those coordinates saved from the height map, you can take a program which I'll link down in the description, which is called MMD. I'm not entirely sure what it stands for anymore, but the name of the program is MMD. You can take a part of OpenStreetMap and take that exact part which you give it the coordinates for and download it as an image. And so that's basically what I've done. I took the height map, imported it into the map editor, and then used a similar map to download an OpenStreetMap image. Take that into whatever image editor that you've got. I actually downloaded paint.net for this thing because I only had GIMP so far, but it's a little bit annoying. So I got paint.net to just quickly do this and invert it, or actually intensified the colors. I'm not entirely sure of the English word for this. But in any case, did that kind of thing, got some plugins to remove certain colors so that I would have an alpha and a transparent map, and then increased the overall transparency of the map so that you can actually see through it. I would actually highly recommend this so you can actually see what I'm placing. If I didn't do that, you would just see the overlay right now. And I think overall that just creates a really good quote-unquote ghost overlay, which you can lay all of the roads underneath. There are some slightly better ways of doing this. I think there are some APIs using which you can exactly get a road system without getting the names everywhere, for instance. But I think this works fine enough, and it's got some of the advantages that it does show some interesting things which you want to leave in there. So for instance, I left the green in there, semi-transparent, to show where the parks are, or the orange/pink in there, semi-transparent, to show where the hospitals are. So there are some major things that I wanted to still show on the map that I can still show on the map here. So that's quite handy. But aside from that, it's really just tracing over the roads and making sure we get all the main roads in place. And by the way, I can already confirm that much. The focus of this episode is to get the main roads in place. So that would be the highways around the city, the tunnels that go underneath the city and some of the parts of the city, as well as some of the main arteries when it comes to the traffic inside the city itself, and creating the sort of rings around the city center. And in the next episode, I'll be working on all of these small roads, which you can see in between here. And there won't be so much building yet. That's really one of the last things that I want to get to. Just want to make sure that the layout of the city is done, which kind of makes things a little bit more boring. I'm personally regretting this at least a little bit, because this meant that I was just placing roads for hours on end, instead of just kind of mixing it up and making it a little bit more fun by placing buildings and trees, etc. during the process. But I think in the end it's a little bit more time efficient to do it this way, and it gives a better idea of how much time I'll be spending on everything in general. And if it really comes to that point where I'll be running out of time toward the end, at the very least the exact layout of the city will be here, and all I'll have to do is just make sure that I get the right themes and zone all kinds of districts across the city to make sure that all of the right sort of buildings just fill up the spaces between the roads where they should. So yeah, that will be quite handy. But yeah, I apologize if it doesn't make for the most interesting time-lapse for now. I just think it's the most efficient way to work. But we'll get into some more interesting things at some points, like creating some of these parks over here, which I think will be definitely some of the most fun parts of the recreation of the city. In any case, at this point I think it's fair to skip forward, because honestly, I don't have much more to say for this episode, and the rest of the time-lapse is just going to be a lot of road placement. So I kind of want to end it here, but not before I actually leave you with some shots of what the final result looks like at the end of this episode. So at the end here, we've got the main road network in place, save for one road that goes along the coastline. All of the islands and the surrounding hills of the city have no developments on them, or nothing but just a few houses, so that'll be something which I'll get to later, but it's not something of a main issue to think about right now. But all of the most important roads should be in place right now, and we should be good to go to fill in all of the gaps once we get to the next episode. By the way, in this shot right here, in the top right corner, is the area where the future Ukern is going to be, which is gonna be something which is quite difficult, and honestly, which I didn't do in this episode yet, since it features a lot of tunnels and roundabouts, and both of those things are kind of difficult to do in Cities Skylines. But I'll get to that at some point, hopefully in episode 3 by the planning of it. But I'll tackle that whole area as a whole, since it's going to be quite important. But overall, I am pretty happy with this draft of the map so far. Obviously, all of the terraforming can still be slightly adjusted to be a little bit more realistic and like real life. Same goes for a lot of these islands and a lot of the foliage, that'll all definitely be adjusted toward the series. And the same also goes for the loot. I might make this a little bit more bright and slightly change up the theme. But so far, I think it works out quite well, and I think we're off to a decent start. So with that said, I would like to thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode.